books, pop culture, and polyphony. This is going to be about music, music in the Middle Ages, and especially the transition from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and Baroque periods. I hope that at the end of my data gathering, which I'm going to be like partway through, I'll be able to make the point that music reflected the medieval culture, obviously with the way it was structured and how it was structured, and then how the style of polyphony was sort of a medium in which it switched from that medieval view of structure and everything in the world is ordered into the more Renaissance Baroque period of it's less structured. And I'll explain what all of that means a little bit later, but that's my goal and my hope as I gather data. So Gregorian chant is what we're working with through most of this period. It's a style, well, it's the official music of the church, which is why it's so popular, because the church runs pretty much the world. It's Pope Gregory I codified it, and codified the chant, which is why it's named after him in about the 6th century. And basically, it's a monophonic style, which means that there's only one sound going at a time, so we have one line of music. It can be sung by one person or by multiple people, it doesn't really matter, but it doesn't have any harmony when it's sung by more people, and it doesn't have an accompaniment. There are no tempo markings, tempo being the speed for anybody. Can I get a quick show of hands if who knows like the basics of music? Anybody? Awesome, that is super helpful. So, tempo. It doesn't have much of a tempo, there's nothing set in stone, so it's up to the singer or performance to decide. And it has a very sort of wandering melody. It's not really driven like what we're used to, where we're going from the starting note to the end. A little bit. A lot of what we sing comes from that, but it's even less free, if you will. And then each line of melody is identified by one of the 8 Greek modes, which is like a scale, but not. It's where we get our major and minor scales, is what it's based off of, but they have, some of them sound similar, and some of them sound very, very different from what we're used to hearing. I'm gonna give you a little listen to it, because what's the point of talking about music if you don't know what it sounds like? And also, this is gonna have a line with women singing. Women, especially at the beginning, would not have been singing it, but it's a good version of it, so. Provided it loads. If it doesn't load, yes.
You can, what you usually do is copy and paste it into Firefox.
Well, it should just hyperlink to it, but because the internet's been spotty, I don't know.
Firefox is usually more consistent.
I'll try that. No, we're
We got an email that they're having problems with the server, which is really unfortunate.
okay.
That's what's going on.
I think that's what's going on. Okay, well.
Can you sing it
Let's see if it
for
comes
us?
up at all. But basically what's happening is there's just one person. It's a group of people. They have amazing tone and quality though, so they all sound like one person, and it's just one line of music. This thing down here, that's the Dies Irae, which is a very well-known piece of music, because this is where you get, when you are familiar with solfege, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. If nothing else, you've seen a Sound of Music, probably. This is what it's based on. This is where we get it. And it's the notes you kind of see, the D and the do and fa. That's just where it comes from, in case anyone is interested, which was the piece that we were going to listen to. So, if you ever want to know a little bit about where our current music and our current system comes from, take a look at that song. It's on YouTube. It's fun. Troubadours. This is the pop music of the time, if you will. It's a little bit later than Gregorian chant. It doesn't really come into full play until about a century and a half later. But it's still a very big part of society. It initiates in France and it's totally separate from the church music and the style. It's still monophonic, you still only have one line of melody, one person singing it, but they're allowed basically to have instrumentalists playing along in the beat. The instrumentalist would improvise based on whatever the other person was singing. So they're still doing the same melody, but they can take more liberty with it as they accompany this. And it's because they're separate from the church and they wander around doing whatever they feel like, and they don't really, they don't have the same structure and they don't have to follow the same system as people writing music for the church had to. And this is also where we get a lot of the themes of love and courtly romance are very popular, and it's still, what do you want? Somebody know what this means?
So that's just ignore it.
Okay, yep. Which, if you'll notice, love is still what we base most of our pop songs on today, and it's just kind of a theme that's continued through music for as long as there's been music, I would imagine. This is music notation of the very early medieval period. You might notice that it is very, very different than what we're used to. The words are interspersed with music. It's these little dots and lines are the notes. So it goes from that, it's like what we're used to seeing, and that's what they were used to seeing. It was actually Boethius who took, this was a Greek tradition, and he took it from the Greek and he taught it to more of the Western society at the time. He was the one who kind of wrote it down and explained it all to everybody over there. So that's where music notation started, and it develops a little bit throughout this period, and then a lot during the Baroque and Classical periods. And the rise of polyphony. So before we talked about monophonic music, this is now polyphonic music. You have more than one sound going at a time. So about in the 9th century, music theorists who are all working for the church started to experiment with what you can do if you have two different lines of melody. And what they would usually do at the beginning, you had two lines of melody and they would run parallel to each other, typically at either the 3rd, 4th, or 5th interval. And the style was called organum, and it produced a very distinctive hollow sound. So basically, for anybody who doesn't know, this is my little staff here. If you have your bass note here, you're going to have your 3rd interval here, your 4th interval here, your 5th there, and they would just pick one of these spaces. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's how you count it. But so then I'm going to pick one of these, and it has that hollow tone because we're used to hearing full chords, which they aren't using yet, which is going to look something like this. You have the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th, and they all stack on each other, and it gives it a very full finished sound. But they haven't started using these chordal tones yet, so you're only going to get 2 of these, which, like I said, isn't going to give you a full sound. It's a very hollow sound because you're literally missing the sound that fills it out in the middle. It's called organum, which I knew what it meant, but I've now just forgotten at the moment. But it's the same root word that we get the word organ from, as in the big pipe organs, and it has that, and organs tend to have that same hollow sound because you're playing unfinished chords a lot of the time. By the 11th century, they're starting to do crazy things where melodic lines are running around and contrasting each other. So instead of just moving like from here to here, and from here to here, this one's going to go here, and this one's going to go here. And they're moving in contrast with each other, which is going to give you a very different and unique sound every time. And it gives you a lot more versatility to the music and to what you can make it sound like. And as this kind of goes along, what ends up happening is you have a tenor line forming where you have that original chant melody that we were talking about before in the Gregorian chant, and they're going along on the bottom, and you have the second line that's sung over top and is using the same melody line but then embellishes it a lot like the troubadours would have done. In Notre Dame Cathedral and the monastery there, the style flourished and people and music theorists are starting to write around them for 3 and 4 voices, which is where we start to get what we have now is choral music with, you have your bass, your tenor, your alto, and your soprano. So polyphonic music, like I said, it's more than one sound, and once it comes into its own closer to the end of the medieval period into the Baroque, you have not just contrasting melodies, not just more than one part, but they're also moving in contrasting rhythms. And they don't necessarily follow the same chord structure, which creates a very distinctive, large sound. It's really cool, and I wish I could play my example for you that I have later, but I can't because the internet isn't working. But it produces a very dissonant sound, and I hope you all know what dissonant means. It's a clash sort of in notes when they don't quite line up, but you feel like they should. And it's completely different from Gregorian chant, which was very straightforward, and you could hear every line and you knew what was coming next. And with polyphonic music, you have a lot more chances to go crazy with it and to do different things. Polyphony and danger, as it progresses, like I said, you get that dissonant sound, you have that weird sound, and the church didn't like it because you're using music theorists were obviously using lyrics based on religious text. And when you have that crazy sound going everywhere and you have different rhythms and people saying words at different times, it distorts the text and you can't understand what it means. I had a music history textbook last year and said, in quotes, that it was the devil's music, and because you couldn't understand, so you could be saying anything, and they had no way to regulate that. So they pretty much banned it from the church. And that was a problem because it was really preventing people from going further with music and doing whatever they wanted. So, like I said, you have homophonic chordal music that are still operating within. During the late medieval period, I skipped that whole section, I apologize. So during the late medieval period, homophonic music is chordal music where you have this again, so you're working within that full sound, but you're still operating within a single chord. You don't have contrasting chords, so you still have a full sound. And people were using 5 or 6 voices to write it, but they were really careful with dissonance because of the way that polyphony was being treated, because you couldn't understand the words. They had to be really careful to make sure everything was easy to hear. And it relied on equality in the voice parts, so you didn't have what we're used to hearing with, like, the soprano will have the melody and everything else is balancing it out, and you hear the melody line the most. At the time, you wrote primarily with all the voices were using the same similar chords so that you hear all the parts at once and you're not focusing more on one over the other. And polyphony didn't usually, it was difficult to make that work. So then this guy named Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, other than having a really awesome name, saved polyphony essentially. He was the guy who worked as a composer and choirmaster for the church. He was very close friends with Pope Julius III, who got him his job as choirmaster in Rome. And, sorry, throw that down, that's cool. And he really liked the style of polyphony, and he wanted to write more of it, and Pope Julius III was all for that. So he started to work on it. 3 weeks after naming Giovanni choirmaster, Pope Julius died. The new pope came in. The new pope didn't like him, kicked him out. So he went out and he got work with other private, well, not really private, still church-related people, but more lords and kings and other people who would support him in his work as he tried to do this. And then eventually he came back and he showed the work he'd done to the new pope. The new pope liked it, and he saved polyphony. What he did while he was working on it is he figured out how to marry the text and the melody so that the music was polyphonic and you had all those big, neat sounds, but you could still understand the words. And what he would do a lot of the time, which would be really helpful if you could listen to it because it sounds really cool, is that all the parts, they start within the same chord singing together, and then it breaks apart all of a sudden, and you have all these different rhythms and lines and melodies going, and then it comes back together again really fast, and you can understand the words and the parts that it comes together, and then he's just repeating the words in the other part. So you know what they're saying, and you get the same effect from the sound.
Try it again, just to see if somehow
because it's really, really awesome. So if you ever, it's like really great
Yeah,
music
that's
to
what I should try.
it's really great music to study to.